Cornhole. To some, the word has a rather crude connotation, but to others, it is simply just one of the best tailgating/lawn games known to man. Welcome to Maraksot's Reviews and How-Tos. My name is Bryan, and today I'm going to bring you guys along and show you how to build your very own set of cornhole boards. So, over the past 7 years or so, I have built maybe more than my fair share of cornhole boards. I've built some for friends, of course some for myself, and some for family members. The latest set that I built is actually of my wife and I's favorite NFL team, Go Hawks. But this time around I wanted to just kind of build a set as kind of a shout out to some of my favorite YouTubers. Some of you may have heard of them and know who they are. Kyle with Awesome Sauce Network and Paul with Paul's Hardware. And I kind of wanted to do this as a little bit of a shout out to them and to their live show Awesome Hardware that they do every Tuesday at 5:30 live on Twitch and also on YouTube. The actual construction process of a set of cornhole boards is actually pretty simple. Only takes a few hours, but when it comes to painting, you can do a simple paint job, which could take a relatively short amount of time, or you can do kind of like what I'm going to be doing, and it's going to take quite a bit more. So far I have about 5 hours or so into the actual design of these particular cornhole boards. And I anticipate with the design I'm going for that it's going to take me many hours of painting to get it all done, but it should look awesome once I finally get it. Now, to keep this tutorial from being too long, I've decided I'm going to break it up into two parts. This first part is going to be of the actual construction process of how you build them, and then part two I will reveal to you my design, as well as show you just the process I go through to lay it all out. So now I think you guys have had enough of this jibber jabber stuff that I'm doing here talking to the camera. Let's get started. So for this set of boards, the wood I'm going to be using is some 3/4 inch plywood for the deck, and then I'm going to use some regular 2x4s for the frame. On the downside, the 3/4 inch plywood is going to make these game boards a bit heavier than usual, but on the upside they'll be very solid and sturdy and should play really nice. I don't like it when the boards are bouncy. Normally I like to use 1/2 inch plywood because it's much lighter weight, but I got this particular piece of wood for free from a remodel job I was working on for my day job, and it was just way too nice a piece of wood to just throw away, so I thought, why not repurpose it into a set of cornhole boards? As you may or may not know, cornhole boards are 24 inches wide and 48 inches long. This piece of plywood I have is 8 foot long and about 30 inches wide, so I'm going to start by cutting it in half so that I'll have two pieces that are roughly 48 inches long. I like to use a razor knife to mark the wood rather than use a pencil because I feel that it's a much more precise way to mark for a cut. Once I measure one side of the board, I then measure the other side, and then we're ready to set up to cut. The most common method of cutting straight lines in materials like plywood is to use a table saw. However, I don't own a table saw, and generally speaking, I think this is true of most people. I think it's much more common for people to own, or at least know someone that owns, a circular saw similar to my skill saw I have here. So I'm going to show you a technique I use to make perfectly straight cuts that involves a circular saw, a straight edge, and a couple of clamps. The first thing you're going to want to do is measure the distance from the edge of the shoe of the saw to the blade. On most saws I've used, this distance is around 1.5 inches, but I always like to measure just to make sure because the width of the teeth on a saw blade can vary from one blade to another. Now that I know what my offset distance is from the edge of the saw's shoe to the edge of the blade, I measure that out and position my straight edge accordingly, and then clamp it into place. In this case, my board is exactly 8 feet long, so I want the center of my saw blade to cut right down the center of my 48-inch mark. So before making the cut, I set my saw up against the edge just to double check and see if the blade was going to cut right where I wanted. I then had to adjust the position of the straight edge a little bit until I had it in the right position to cut the wood perfectly in half like I wanted. Now, before I go ahead and start making this cut, I feel that I should do the responsible thing and share a little safety tip with you guys. Whenever working with any tools, it's important to use them safely. This is especially true of power tools like this circular saw. Before cutting a board, always adjust the depth of your blade. If the blade depth is set too deep, then that poses a serious safety risk to anything that may accidentally get in the path of the blade underneath the piece of wood you're cutting. For example, fingers, hands, arms, and legs. As you can see here, with the blade set to full depth, anything caught under here is going to be cut clean off. So always make sure to set the blade depth where it's just deep enough to cut through whatever material you're cutting. As you can see now, setting the blade to this depth is much safer. Alright, so with our little safety meeting out of the way, let's get back to the action. Once I had my two 48-inch pieces, I then needed to rip them down from 30 inches wide to 24 inches wide. So I repeated the same process of marking the boards, offsetting my straight edge from my mark, clamping the straight edge in place, and then making the final cuts. Since the piece of plywood I have was stained and finished to serve its former purpose, and I need a clean, unfinished surface for my new paint job to adhere to, some sanding was in order to get the surface prepped for paint. And thanks to the wonder that is video editing, the 2 hours and 4 pieces of sandpaper that it took me passed by in mere seconds. And now that the decks are all clean and prepped, it's time to move on to building the frames. As I mentioned earlier in this video, I'm just going to use some regular 2x4s to build the frames. And so to build them for this set of boards, I'm going to need a total of 4 48-inch long pieces and 4 24-inch long pieces, because I'm going to be mitering all the ends in order to create a super clean look. My plan is to fill all the seams between the different pieces of wood so that the finished boards will look like one solid unit. You can also butt the ends together like this, in which case you want to shorten the 48-inch long side rails down by 3 inches so that they measure 45 inches long instead. Once I had all my pieces cut, it was then time to put them all together. Some people use nails, or I've even seen people use heavy-duty staples to nail everything together. However, I personally like to use screws. Screws are just much more secure, and I don't want these things ever coming apart. Being the anal personality type that I am, I like to pilot my screw holes first and then screw everything together. Now, I'm not going to be showing me screwing all 4 corners of the frame together, because really all that footage looks exactly the same. So once you've screwed one corner together, just go ahead and repeat the process for all the remaining corners. Now that we've got our frames all securely fastened together, it's time to fasten on our plywood decks. The first thing I like to do at this point is, of course, dry fit the deck and make sure everything lines up nicely. I then lay out a nice bead of wood glue on the top edge of the frame and then carefully place the deck onto the frame. Once again, I'll be using screws to secure the deck in place. I like to start in one corner by lining up the edges of the deck with the frame, pilot my screws, and then use 2 screws to secure that corner. I then go to the corner directly diagonally opposite of that first corner and repeat the process. I then secure the 2 remaining corners before moving on around all the edges and fastening the rest of the deck to the frame. Once I had everything all glued and screwed together, I took my sander to all those rough edges to knock them down and just get things all nice and smoothed out. Once all the sanding was complete, I did a little dusting off and then busted out my wood filler and began filling all those screw holes and the seams and everything between all the different pieces of wood. After putting the first coat of wood filler on, there was a few spots that needed a little more love, so I hit those spots with a second coat, let it dry, and then it was once again time to break out my trusty palm sander. Okay, so now I'm starting to get pretty excited because these boards are pretty much ready for paint. But before we can move on to part 2 of this video, there's a couple last things I need to do here. That being to construct the legs of our boards, and of course to cut out the holes. The size and placement of the hole is a very important part of any set of cornhole boards. The hole needs to be 6 inches in diameter, and you locate the center of the hole by measuring down from the top edge of the board 9 inches, and then you center it from each side of the board, which should be at right about 12 inches in. On past sets of cornhole boards, I've just used a compass to draw the circle, and then I've cut it out using a jigsaw. But a few years ago, my dad's neighbor built himself and a few of his relatives and friends some boards, and actually went out and bought a 6-inch diameter hole saw, which is like really awesome for this. So I decided I'd borrow that from him. I cut my holes and then sanded off those newly made rough edges. The last thing I need to do before I can move on to paint is to build and fit the legs. When the boards are finished and ready to play on, the top edge of the deck needs to be 12 inches from the ground. In the past, I've just propped up the end of my boards where it's 12 inches off the ground, taken some pieces of 2x2 and then just held them in place and marked them. But this time around, I wanted to do things a little more high-tech. One of the things I do for work is draw house plans and other things using AutoCAD, so I thought I'd try out designing the legs in CAD and then seeing how they turn out. And although I think it kind of overcomplicated the leg making process a little bit, I think they turned out really nice. Another thing I usually do is use carriage bolts to attach the legs to the frame, but since I'm building these for Paul and Kyle, in the spirit of Pimp My PC, I wanted to make things look as smooth and clean as possible, so I used some lag bolts instead, which I feel really did the trick. Man, that was a lot of work, but construction is now complete, which means that we've also completed part 1 of this video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope that you go and hit that thumbs up button and give it a like. And if you're still hanging around and you hated this video, then click that one. You know, you can do that. And if your feelings are a little bit more complicated than this or this, then why don't you leave a comment down in the comment section, or if you have a question for me or something, go ahead, leave it down there. That's what it's for. If you're excited to see part 2 and you are not yet subscribed to my channel, please click the subscribe button right over here, and you will then get notified once I upload part 2, and then you guys can check out the design and see how it all turned out in the end. And as always, this button over here works if you are watching on your PC. If you're watching on a smartphone or tablet, then push the little subscribe button that you see here in the picture over here. Once again, I want to say thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today and for watching this video. And I guess now it's time to get ready for part 2, huh? All right, we'll see you next time.